This is question number 5 of QZ9. Suppose the demand for reserves is initially R subscript 0 and superscript D in the figure 2 on the right. So this requires you to not round your answers. Non-borrowed reserves equals borrowed reserves, federal funds rate, the discount rate, and the interest rate on reserves. So this question basically examines our familiarity with basic shapes and basic parameters of the demand and supply curves for reserves. We know that demand curves is like downward sloping and then horizontal, and supply curve is vertical and then horizontal. And then we should understand the lower portion of the demand curve that basically refers to the interest rate on the reserves, which basically the Fed started to pay after the 2007-2008 financial crisis. And the horizontal part of the supply curve is the discount rate that banks can borrow from the Fed. The interest rate that applies, that is the discount rate. So, and the intersection of the supply curve and the demand curve is basically the federal funds rate. So as long as we understand these basic parameters, this question should be very straightforward to answer. And we also should understand the two parts of the supply curve. This vertical portion basically refers to the open market reserves due to the open market operations, which is also called non-borrowed, because that reserves is because of the purchases made by the Federal Reserve for the securities, mainly the treasury securities. So that part has nothing to do with the interest rate. So that's why it's vertical. And then once the federal funds rate is equal to this discount rate, and then firms may start to borrow from the Fed because the interest rate they borrow from each other will be the same as the interest rate they borrow from the Fed. So this portion, the horizontal portion here, refers to when the interest rate, the federal funds rate equals to the discount rate, and then firms will be indifferent between borrowing from the Fed and borrowing from each other through the federal funds market. Of course, here it ignores the so-called stigma effect, which is the effect that banks actually are very reluctant to borrow from the Fed than borrowing from each other, because borrowing from the Fed has sort of a stigma associated with it. It simply shows to the market that the bank is in such a dire situation that they need the help from the government, from the Fed. But here it ignores such a stigma effect. So once the interest rate that they borrow from each other equals the interest rate that they can borrow from the Fed, then they can start to borrow from the Fed. That's basically what this horizontal portion of the supply curve refers to. So that's the basic structure of this demand and the supply curves. So with that in mind, we can answer these questions. Non-borrowed reserves, as we said, this refers to the vertical portion of the supply curve, and you can look at the number here. That's basically 40 billion. So we just fill in this 40. And borrowed reserves, we can see the intersection of the initial R0D, even though here it also gives you a R1D, but actually R1D here is not it's not useful here. The only information we need is the initial position R0D and RS. So the intersection here is the equilibrium federal funds rate. And so you can see that the intersection is on the vertical part of the supply curve. So that means the borrowed reserves, which means the reserves that the banks borrow from the Fed, is actually zero. There's no borrowed reserves on this vertical portion. All these are non-borrowed reserves through open market purchases. And the federal funds rate is this equilibrium rate, which is 5.5. Do not round your answer, so just put this 5.5. And the discount rate, as we said, that's the vertical portion, that's the horizontal portion of the supply curve, 6.5. And the interest rate on reserves, that's basically the lower portion or the horizontal portion of the demand curve, that's 4.5. So check my answer, and your input is correct.